What if I told you that the same language of calls, sounds, and body language used by birds to stay in touch with their flocks and find mates was once used by early hunters and gatherers to locate dangerous animals and avoid being eaten by lions and tigers? And what if I told you that same language still exists today, and if you learn to understand it, the birds will tell you amazing things about your environment, including where to find rarely seen wild animals like owls, cats, foxes, and hawks? So what exactly is this secret language of birds? I want you to imagine that you're taking a walk in the forest. It's a beautiful day, the birds are all singing and feeding peacefully in the understory, when suddenly in the distance you start to hear screaming. And it's gradually getting closer and closer until finally you see a huge mob of people running at full speed towards you. They're looking behind themselves as they run, they're tripping over branches and scrambling to get back up. They're clearly running away from something that has scared them absolutely to death. But how do you know that they're scared? How do you know that they're being chased by something, even though they haven't said a single word? It's because they're using a pattern of body language, vocalization, and movement that communicates the presence of danger without the need for complex verbal interaction. You don't need to sit down and have a conversation with them in order to understand that something's chasing them. So this little scenario really gets to the heart of what this secret language of birds is and how it works, because at the most primitive core, the primary concern of birds is to survive. And whenever their survival is threatened by a possible danger, birds experience a fight or flight response that causes them to move their position, their body language will change, and they change their patterns of vocalization. And it's this change in all the different sounds and movement patterns that birds make when their life is in danger that forms a huge part of all the communication being passed around by birds out in nature. It's like a forest-wide surveillance system that can be heard and seen from far and wide throughout the landscape, warning the other birds, and possibly you, whenever danger is in the area. So back when humans were still living in a Paleolithic way, one of the reasons we were able to survive is because we understood bird language. At that time in history, the level of technology we had was very minimal. We wandered the landscape as hunter-gatherer nomads in small groups with vulnerable young children and elders all together. And at the same time, there were incredibly dangerous animals actively hunting us, like lions and sabre-toothed tigers. And these animals, whenever they move through a landscape, they cause a ripple in the substrate of bird language that can be heard in some cases from hundreds of meters away. And it enables us to predict really valuable things for survival, like where those animals are right now, which direction they're traveling, even how fast they're moving. So we no longer have the survival need to pay attention for lions and saber-toothed cats, but this same bird warning system still happens for all animals that pose a danger to birds. So when I first started studying bird language, one of the things my mentors told me is that everything in bird language exists on a spectrum, from body language and sounds that communicate safety, all the way to body language and sounds that communicate fight or flight information. And if you can just understand this spectrum of behavior in birds, this will give you a very practical understanding of bird language. And there are 4 major signposts that we can use to know what messages birds are communicating along this spectrum. You can look for these 4 signs in your own backyard to understand what birds are saying. Bird songs are some of the most recognizable sounds that birds make, and these are a major foundation of bird language because singing is used to mark territories and attract mates, which are both really key things in the life of birds. But on a deeper level, there's an even more subtle communication in birdsong that lets us know birds are feeling relatively safe from predators whenever they engage in territorial and courtship behaviors. So birdsong is a really good indicator on the safety side of the bird language spectrum. The same is true for when you see birds feeding in flocks on the ground. Gathering food is such a key part of every bird's life that they naturally integrate a host of nonverbal cues and sounds that indicate varying levels of safety and alertness while feeding. When birds feel safe from predators, they feed at a constant pace and rhythm, so the calls and body language all communicate a feeling of safety. But if they detect predators out in the distance, their feeding rhythms will start to slow down and become more intermittent as they spend time sitting, watching, and listening for danger. If the predator gets too close, there comes a point where birds will stop feeding and singing entirely and go into full-on alertness and defensive postures. And this is where we start to enter the realm of alarm communication. But in order to understand alarms, we also first need to understand territorial communication, because territorial interactions in birds actually look very similar to alarm. When I first started seeing territorial aggression in my backyard robins, I found it very confusing because the calls are so loud and the movement is so intense that I often wondered whether they were alarming at a predator. But if you look carefully, this robin is actually chasing another robin, and that is classic territorial communication. Even though it has a similar intensity to being chased by a hawk or stalked by a cat, territorial aggression is actually another sign that birds are feeling safe from predators. I eventually learned after hundreds of hours investigating these sounds that alarm behavior is often actually more subtle than territorial behavior. Robins are a perfect example of this because their territorial aggression is so intense. They fly at each other, they chase each other, and they make really loud calls. But when there's a cat, they often make a call that just sounds like a very basic tut. And it repeats over and over and over again in this very subtle way. And to a person who doesn't know what this robin is saying, you would most likely think, oh, it's just some bird making a little call. But to someone who knows bird language, that soft little call says volumes. And in fact, they don't just use this call for house cats. This soft little call is an alarm signal that gets made for cats of all different sizes, including cats that posed a major threat to humans in our prehistoric origins. I actually had one particular experience when I was sitting outside at the edge of a forest listening to what I thought were alarm calls for a house cat, when suddenly, to my surprise, a mountain lion popped out of the woods, followed by her 2 kittens. And I realized, oh wait, that's not a small cat, that's a big cat. And so I learned that the main difference between house cat alarms and the alarms for much larger felines is the overall size of the response from birds. When a mountain lion or bobcat moves in the forest, their alarm response tends to be a lot bigger and involve a lot more birds over a wider range, but the actual calls themselves can actually be very similar to a house cat. And just imagine how helpful it would be to have even just 5 minutes of extra warning time before a lion attacks you from the bushes. That 5 minutes could be the deciding factor in whether your family gets eaten or whether you escape and avoid a confrontation. And this same cat alarm sequence probably happens right in your own backyard every single day without you even realizing it. And once you start seeing into this secret language of birds, it opens up a whole world of exciting mysteries, from foxes and coyotes to raccoons, bears, and weasels. And there are actually quite a few animals that cause much louder alarms than cats, including hawks and owls. So if you want to learn more, go check out my video on how to find owls. Owls are probably some of the easiest of all predators to find with bird language, so it's a perfect place to start if you'd like to actually learn this skill for yourself. So go watch that video, and I'll talk to you next time.